Good evening, everyone. My name is Ajay Verma, advocate, and I am back again with the wonderful another virtual learning session for all of you. And as you all are aware that IBJ India, in collaboration with Bar Council of Delhi, started some learning sessions for all of you. And we thought that this is the time where we will call it as a learning in pandemic. So today also we have come up with a wonderful session with an expert on the subject, and none other than Honorable Mr. Sanjay Jain sir, Senior Advocate and Additional Solicitor General of India. And since 2019, Mr. Sanjay Jain has been representing as an additional Solicitor General of India before the Honorable Supreme Court and representing the government on very crucial subjects. And in fact, he is an expert on civil law subjects. And today, he will be sharing the steps in a civil trial in a very crisp form for all of you.
Good evening, friends. Before I tell you about the 9 steps in a civil trial, I will first begin with two sayings of two great persons. The first person is Kabir, who said something 500 years ago. He said, पहले लिख और पीछे दे, भूल पड़े तो कागज से ले. Translated in English, first documents, delivery later. In case of doubt, documents matter. These two lines of Kabir precisely summarize the whole essence of civil disputes or civil litigation. The second saying which I am recalling is that of our legendary lawyer Mr. Ashok Sen, who once explained the process of preparing a civil trial. He said, and I quote, the first step is marshal your facts. Second step is search law according to your facts. And third, present facts according to your law. So, if we see in these 3 lines, almost everything is covered, because whenever we start preparing a matter, we need to be on the right side of law. We cannot prepare a plaint in the air without being sure of law. So first of all, I have to marshal my facts, have to have a detailed conference and meetings with client. He will tell me as to what the facts are. For instance, he has come to me for filing a redemption suit, a mortgage redemption suit under Order 34 of CPC. Now that suit has certain legal requirements. So what I have done in the first step, I have marshaled the facts. After marshalling the facts, I am trying to learn the law, because that law has to be applied to my facts. And once I do with that exercise of finding and applying the law to my facts, then I have to present my facts in accordance with law. For instance, a Order 34 suit requires a preliminary decree and a final decree. So can there be a plaint under Order 34 CPC which does not ask for the relief of preliminary decree? Another example, in the same type of suits, I have to give a detailed description of the location of the property. So for that, I need to know the law. So there is inevitably a close link between the facts and the law, and unless I know both, it is not possible for me to do justice to any civil trial. And in fact, unless I know the both, there is no point my taking even the first step in a civil trial. Now I have crystallized these steps into 9 steps. In my humble submission, the first step which we have is the drafting of plaint and valuation of suit for the purposes of court fees and jurisdiction. This is the first step which every lawyer would face whenever he is preparing a matter. When we say drafting of plaint has several parts. The topmost part is the name of court, which court you are applying. Then the title of the suit, then heading of the suit, then the factual metrics, and then summarization of cause of action, keeping in mind that I also have to speak about the limitation. Directly or indirectly, I have to state in the cause of action paragraph as to how my suit is within limitation. Thereafter, valuation of suit for the purposes of court fees and jurisdiction, then territorial jurisdiction, prayer, and verification. Now, each part of the plaint is of extreme importance, especially factual narrative onwards. The factual narrative is to be stated in a very concise manner. In fact, Delhi High Court has come out with rules as regards pleading, and the pleading particularly with regard to the factual metrics. I am proposing to read from these rules because they will clarify as to what High Court expects you. The first is the whole case must be stated in the pleadings. That is to say, all material facts must be stated. Second, only material facts are to be stated. The evidence by which they are to be proved are not to be stated. Third, the facts are to be stated concisely. Fourth, it is not necessary to allege the performance of any condition precedent. The mere averment of performance is implied in every pleading. However, you have to say that non-performance of condition precedent is there, and that must be stated very categorically. Then it is not necessary to set out the whole or any part of a document unless the precise words thereof are necessary. It is sufficient to state the effect of the document as briefly as possible. Then it is not necessary to allege a matter of fact which the law presumes. And then when misrepresentation, fraud, undue influence, etc. are pleaded, necessary particulars must always be given. And lastly, when a suit prima facie is time barred, the ground on which exemption is claimed must be categorically stated. So these are the guidelines which Delhi High Court has framed for every pleading, which every pleading must contain as regards the factual metrics part of it is concerned. Thereafter, we travel to a very important paragraph, that is the paragraph with regard to the summarization of the right to sue, or in other words, cause of action paragraph. It is the cause of action paragraph only which tells the reader of the plaint as to when did the cause of action first begin, when the cause of action again occurred in the due course of time, and when did the cause of action last occur. Because these averments as regards the cause of action having occurred are necessary and important to ascertain as to whether the suit is within limitation. Thereafter, the most technical part of the suit comes and confronts every lawyer, and that is the valuation of the suit for the purposes of court fees and jurisdiction. My friends would be aware of it, and if not, let me tell you that the Court Fees Act has two types of court fee. One is an ad valorem court fee, other is a fixed court fee. In most of the matters, it is ad valorem court fee which is applicable. Fixed court fee is applicable only in a very few types of matter. For instance, a suit for mere declaration, where no consequential relief is paid. In those type of matters, a fixed court fee is sufficient. But in all other matters, you have to value the suit for the purposes of calculating the court fee. And that court fee will also determine the pecuniary jurisdiction of the court. For instance, if the value of the suit is up to the valuation which is permissible for a court of sub-judge or subordinate judiciary, then accordingly it must be stated. Because your value of the suit may be such as may require the suit to be filed before a district judge, and it may be such as may be required the suit to be filed before High Court in the original side, whether in commercial courts or in the non-commercial courts. Because when I am going to tell you about the 9 steps in a civil trial, they will hold good even for commercial courts, and they will substantially hold good even for arbitration trials or arbitration proceedings. So once we are done with the first step, that is drafting of a plaint, and then valuation of the suit, then we also have to pay attention to the verification of the suit. Verification is not a mere formality or an administrative exercise. Verification of a suit is a very serious business. We have to state very categorically as to which particular paragraphs of the plaint are verified on my knowledge, whether that knowledge is my personal knowledge or is a knowledge derived from the records of the firm or the company, in case the plaintiff is a firm or a company. If the plaintiff is an individual, then obviously it is his own knowledge. Similarly, those paragraphs also need to be separately identified, which are the paragraphs in respect of which information has been received by the plaintiff and it is believed to be true by him. And then the verification clause goes on to say that the last paragraph is by way of prayer. So verification in a sense summarizes the suit, and at the time of cross-examination it provides a clue to the other party as to whether the pleadings which have been made on knowledge and the pleadings which have been made only on information, what kind of questions have to be asked. For instance, if a particular paragraph has been verified on information received and believed to be true, and any question comes in the cross-examination which tries to probe the plaintiff or a witness, primarily plaintiff, as regards the veracity of a particular proposition, an objection can be taken by the plaintiff's counsel that, look, this aspect has been verified on the information received. So when the plaintiff himself has not verified this particular averment in the pleading on the personal knowledge, where is the question of a question being asked as regards his knowledge on that particular proposition? So therefore verification is extremely important. Then we travel to the second stage or the second step, and second step is from the perspective of the defendants. This is strategy formation to file written statement of defense and take a call as to whether or not to take a plea of rejection of plaint. Because when we are filing written statement, we may also decide as to whether we should file an application under Order 7, Rule 11 of CPC seeking rejection of plaint on any one of the grounds or more of the grounds which are stated in Order 7, Rule 11. Even in the matters which are not directly covered by CPC, the plea as regards maintainability can be taken, and the popular pleas as regards maintainability which are taken in the usual course are that the defendant is not a necessary or a proper party, that there is no cause of action, that there is no jurisdiction, suit valuation is not proper, adequate court fee has not been paid, the suit is barred by law, there is a material concealment of facts, the suit is barred by limitation, or the suit is not maintainable on any other ground. So these 9 basic preliminary objections are available to the defendant when he is preparing the written statement of defense. And needless to say, written statement of defense is primarily structured on the defense on merits. These preliminary objections are good only for persuading the court to frame issues of law, or to persuade the court to frame a preliminary issue as to the maintainability, or to persuade the court in support of my application or the defendant's application for rejection of plaint. But ultimately, if these preliminary objections are not entertained, the defense of the defendant will sink or swim on the basis of the merits of the defense. Therefore, it is extremely important that whatever the defendant does not agree with, as is stated in the plaint, the defendant must state that this particular averment is denied. Whether you use the surplusage such as vehemently denied, categorically denied, specifically denied is up to you. Nonetheless, there has to be a categorical or clear-cut denial made out from the language in which you structure your defense. So you have to be categorical about 2 things. First, you say that you have a disagreement, you traverse the statement made by the plaintiff, and then you state what according to you is the fact. Because it is not good enough to say that it is wrong and denied, it is wrong and denied. In fact, now the commercial court rules make it very categorical that if you make such an evasive written statement which is contained only of wrong and deny kind of averments, it is no good. It will be taken as an admission then. So therefore, it is not good enough to say that this is not correct. If the plaintiff says that this is the description of the property and this is the site plan, and as a defendant you disagree, then you have to say that, look, according to me, this is the description of the property and this is the correct site plan. So your version also has to be stated. So therefore, I use the expression very knowingly and deliberately when I said forming a strategy to file written statement of defense. Written statement is not just a clerical or an academic act. Filing of written statement is highly strategic because in the long run, the defendant's defense right up to the highest court will depend upon his written statement, just as the plaintiff's case will depend upon the plaint which he has filed. So therefore, when the defendant is preparing his defense, he has to keep in mind all these strategies as regards the legal defense, the factual defense, and at the same time, it has to be made very clear that anything which is important and anything which is relevant must be stated in the written statement. You cannot play a hide and seek game. You cannot rely on the later amendment, subsequent amendment that all right, let me first file a written statement without disclosing this fact. Let the replication come and thereafter I will see as to whether I have to state this fact or not. This is a very myopic strategy. I do not recommend that. Third stage, which is coming in every civil trial and which is where lot of mind has to be applied, there has to be a huge amount of application of mind, is marking exhibits of documents at the stage of admission and denial. I must forewarn my friends that admission or denial must be taken very, very seriously. Any document of the other side if that document has emanated from you, ought not to be denied in a routine manner. There is a tendency to deny all the documents of the defendants, and defendants usually end up denying all the documents of the plaintiff. Now, that may not be the correct strategy. The correct strategy is that we have to see who is the author of the document, who is the source of the document. If defendant has filed a document and the document belongs to the plaintiff, there is no reason or occasion for the plaintiff to deny the said document. So, therefore, admission or denial has to be done in a very, very apt manner with lot of application of mind, keeping all the pros and cons in mind, and also keeping in mind that if you deny a document which belongs to you, tomorrow you may end up facing a section 340 proceedings or some other proceedings for speaking a lie on oath, because we are well aware that these days, apart from the verification, both plaint and the written statement need to be supported by a detailed affidavit. And what is an affidavit? Affidavit is a statement on oath, because every time we cannot ask the court to record our statement on oath, so affidavits are filed. This is the purpose of affidavits. So instead of court giving you the oath for speaking truth, it is the oath commissioner or the notary public which gives you the oath for speaking the truth. Affidavits have to be taken seriously. It is not that you state something on affidavit with the hope that all right, tomorrow you, whenever it doesn't feel good to you, whenever it doesn't agree with your conscience at that point in time, or it doesn't agree with your strategy, you will deny it or you will try to wriggle out of it. It may not be possible. Short-term strategies are highly de-recommended. Now, in admission and denial, what you must keep in mind is that every document of the defendant which is admitted by you has to be endorsed with an exhibit mark, and the exhibit marks will be like D1, D2, D3, etc. And every document of the plaintiff which is admitted will be endorsed as P1, P2, P3, etc. This endorsement has to be countersigned by the presiding officer of the court, because each document which is admitted needs to be countersigned by the presiding officer of the court. Then only the exhibit marking is complete. And this exhibit marking is important because all those documents which have not been admitted party, whether it is plaintiff or defendant, to prove the same documents in the course of the evidence. Because the moment you admit a document in the admission or denial, to that extent you are bound. Your admission will bind you. And if your admission is of such a nature that no evidence is required, then under Order 15, Rule 3, CPC, the court may say that all right, even though I have framed the issues, I believe that there is no requirement of going for any evidence and I can straightway hear the arguments. And also, if the admission or denial is such that the court is unable to find any area of disagreement, then the court may refuse to frame any issue and straightway proceed to pass a decree on the basis of the admission. So therefore, admission or denial are extremely important, very crucial, and that is the first stage also for the marking of exhibits of the documents. This is extremely important because most of the people think that the exhibits are marked only when the evidence begins. No, the first opportunity to mark the exhibits is the stage of admission or denial. The fourth stage or the fourth step is framing of issues, and when I say framing of issues, it includes framing of preliminary issue as well. Now, please appreciate, issues are framed by the court even though the parties carry their proposed issues with them. It is not the parties who frame the issues. The responsibility to frame the issues is that of the court. even if the parties do not give any proposed issues, the court still has to frame the issues. So the responsibility of the court to frame the issues is not left unassisted. That is why we recommend that we should go with the proposed issues, also suggesting as to who has to prove that issue. The onus of proof is also extremely important. Therefore, we as a litigant or we as a litigating lawyers should not leave the task of framing issues only to the court, because more often than not what happens is that the onus of proof is placed on a wrong party if the court is not properly assisted in framing of the issues. That is one. Secondly, the issue is framed in such a manner that even though the issue should have been framed with onus to plaintiff, it comes as an issue with onus to defendant. The basic principle is one who averts must prove. I have stated something, I have to prove it. So therefore the issue has to be in a language where only the person making that statement is required to prove it. So onus of proof in the framing of issues cannot be undermined. Then it must also be kept in mind, especially from the point of view of the defendant, that the defendant succeeds in getting some maintainability issue as an issue of preliminary importance, which are known as preliminary issues. If the defendant succeeds in getting a preliminary issue framed, then the court may be persuaded to hear arguments on the preliminary issue first before putting the parties to trial. And if on the preliminary issue itself the court is able to pronounce judgment, then both the parties can be saved from the rigmarole of trial. Therefore, preliminary issues are of equal importance, and we must keep in mind that court is obligated to pronounce judgment on all issues. Therefore, all those judgments in which the court does not pronounce judgment or does not decide any particular issue and leaves it unattended, the judgment is fundamentally flawed. Once the issues are framed, all issues must be discussed in the judgment. And needless to say, issues are framed only on the points of variance. If there is no variance, if the defendant agrees with what plaintiff says, there are no issues which can be struck. And if defendant varies with the plaintiff, the issues ought to be struck, and therefore there can be two kind of issues of fact and issues of law. So this is primarily the whole canvas of issues which need to be kept in mind by all of us, the litigating lawyers. And how important framing of issues is need not be overemphasized, keeping in view that you may end up proving something which in the first place the onus of which should have been on the other side. So therefore, don't invite a responsibility which is not yours, and be completely aware and fully alert when the issues are being framed. The fifth step is preparing list of witnesses and deciding as to which witnesses need to be summoned, because even after Order 18 Rule 4, where the parties have liberty to file the evidence by way of affidavits of certain witnesses, needless to say that those witnesses whose affidavit you have been able to achieve or secure, they need not be summoned. They are your witnesses, you bring them. But strategically speaking, it may not be advisable that even if it is possible to approach a witness, you approach a witness and get his affidavit in advance. It may not be desirable, because the other side will have a lot to do in the cross-examination. He will ask, who approached you? How did you know him? So all those questions can be avoided. So it is better that if there is a person who is a stranger to you, at least on face of it, any person who is a stranger to you, it is advisable that that person's affidavit should not be filed in examination of chief. On the contrary, that person should be summoned as a summoned witness, as a requisitioned witness. For instance, I would suggest that more often than not, whenever you are going for an expert witness, try to get the expert witness summoned. But if it is of highly technical nature, then yes, of course, you would prefer to have an affidavit prepared. So it depends. The strategy will vary depending upon the facts and the attending circumstances of the case. So when you are preparing the list of witnesses, at that stage only you have to decide which witness you will produce on your own and which witness will be summoned through court. And please remember it, that all your witnesses are not only the witnesses of facts. All your witnesses may not be the witnesses of primary evidence. Some of your witnesses may be the witnesses only of documents. Some of the witnesses who may be the witnesses to bring the secondary evidence. So therefore, preparing the list of witnesses which needs to be filed within 15 days of framing of issues is very important, and I will recommend that when the plaint is prepared, at least for the plaintiff, when the plaint is prepared, at that point in time only the plaintiff should visualize as to who are going to be his witnesses. That is the most correct strategy of doing a civil trial. Those lawyers or those litigants who decide about the witnesses when the issues are framed, then they will be left stranded. More often than not, they are left stranded. They would not be really in a position to decide as to who has to come in the witness box, apart from the party themselves. So therefore, when the plaint is structured at that point in time, the plaintiff, and when the written statement is structured at that point in time, the defendant should have in mind as to who are going to be their witnesses. And we also would be knowing, but let me tell you that it is not good enough that you propose some person as a witness and that is the end of all. Sometimes the court may find that a particular person's testimony is important and either the plaintiff or the defendant has not cited that person or has not brought that person as a witness. The court on its own accord can also requisition the presence of a person as a witness. This aspect we may keep in mind. Therefore, and the moral of the story is this, therefore, there should not be any hide and seek game. Please produce your best evidence. Please produce each and every person who ought to be produced as witness. And don't rely or don't relegate a situation to that extent that the court is compelled to direct the presence of a person as a witness, because then you lose a wonderful opportunity. Had you brought that witness, maybe you could have asked the questions in the examination in chief, or you could have given his examination in chief affidavit. If you leave that situation to that extent that the court is compelled to requisition the presence of a witness, then the court will ask the questions and you lose that opportunity. So this is a very delicate balance which has to be maintained. Similarly, in all those cases where secondary evidence as regards the production of documents is involved, please comply with the requirements of section 65 and 66 of the Evidence Act. Please give the other party notice to produce. Then only it will be proper that you place your secondary evidence on record and succeed in getting it marked as an exhibit. Because when you eventually file, which is the next stage, and the next stage I am straightway coming, is stage number 6 or is step number 6. Step 6 is preparing affidavits of examination in chief and exhibiting the documents not marked as exhibits at the time of admission or denial as exhibits. So it is at this stage this becomes important. So if you have not given notice to produce and you are placing some documents in your examination in chief affidavit and marking them as exhibits, the other party is likely to take objection. So therefore, this trial business is all integrated. Even though I am telling it stage wise or step wise, these steps may not necessarily be isolated or in falling in totally different fields. These steps are interlinked and you have to anticipate and envisage all steps in advance. In fact, the brilliant lawyers are those who have their case laws of the final argument ready at the time of preparing the plaint. So therefore, it is all integrated. Now, when we come to the preparation of affidavit, I have a very serious complaint against a lot of my colleagues and younger friends. They end up paraphrasing the entire plaint or the written statement in the examination in chief affidavit, which is highly undesirable. Examination in chief affidavit is not a reproduction or a mirror image of the plaint or the written statement. That is something which you have to prepare, keeping in mind the principles which I read over, the principles of pleadings. Whatever evidence was recommended to be excluded from the pleading is required to be included in the affidavit. In the plaint, you don't plead evidence. In the affidavit of evidence, you plead evidence. You are basically stating evidence. So you don't have to reproduce the plaint or the written statement. You simply state your evidence. Wherever you want to refer to a document, the brief description of which needs to be given, you give the description of the document, but don't reproduce the whole document. Because ultimately, the document itself will be read. If the document is marked as exhibit and the court accepts a document as an exhibit, then the court is bound to read the document as a whole. So whatever is written in the document will be read eventually at the time of final arguments or whenever the judgment is written. So therefore, where is the need of quoting the whole document in the affidavit of evidence? Which is another mistake which a lot of people do, which is for which there is no need to do. So you have to prepare your affidavit in a very crisp manner. And at the same time, you please remember that these days, lot of evidence comes in the form of emails or the electronic evidence. Kindly make sure that you comply with the requirement of Section 65B of the Evidence Act at this stage only. Because if you forget about 65B Evidence Act and you end up exhibiting the emails, you will face a problem. Other side is not going to permit it. So therefore, as I said, that at each stage, there is some other order of CPC which may be involved. There is some other order of Commercial Court Act which may be involved. There is some section of Evidence Act which may be involved. So you have to be very, very comprehensively prepared for each stage. The next stage which comes after this is cross-examination. Now this cross-examination is a very fascinating thing for all the young lawyers. It is very romantic. It has been romanticized to a great extent in all the criminal trials. We have seen the cross-examinations in the films. But that is not the real cross-examination. Don't get over-inspired by the cross-examinations that you have hitherto seen in the motion pictures. For the cross-examination, the best strategy is to learn. And how to learn it? As a young lawyer, you should go in the court, watch your senior colleagues or other colleagues who are doing the cross-examination. There is no substitute to the actual exposure to the cross-examination for learning the cross-examination. And the golden rule of cross-examination is not what to ask. Golden rule of the cross-examination is what not to ask. Because more often than not, people end up blowing off their case in the cross-examination by asking a question from the witness which they should not have asked, because the witness ends up stating something which damages the case of the party who is asking the cross-examination question. So please be extremely skeptical and careful in asking questions, particularly from a intelligent witness. And therefore, in the cross-examination, it is advisable that you ask first 3-4 innocuous questions so that you gauge the witness, you assess the witness. After 3-4 questions, when the 3-4 questions are asked and you understand as to what kind of answers the witness is giving, then accordingly you formulate your strategy as to what to ask and what not to ask. Don't ask your best questions immediately in the beginning, because you do not even know as to how the witness is going to respond. So cross-examination is an art. It is not something which can be taught in a law school, or for that matter in a seminar. Of course, we can deal with the aspect of cross-examination in the workshops. There have been some workshops which are being organized in the courts, sometime in High Court and other courts, where the finer points of cross-examinations are being told. For instance, primarily what you have to do in the cross-examination is to put your case across. You have to put your case in a positive or affirmative manner and ask the other side whether is it so or is it not so. So these are the best ways of asking questions. And in this fashion, you will end up giving all the suggestions of your case, because if you do not put your case across in the cross-examination, then tomorrow the honorable judge may say that, look, you did not even put it to the witness. So how can you rely upon this plea? So therefore, cross-examination is very, very crucial. I am not saying that it is more crucial than the examination in chief, because people have this tendency to undermine the value of examination in chief, which is wrong, because examination in chief is something which states your case in a positive manner, and in cross examination you are actually depending upon so many factors. You are actually looking for a stupid witness, and if you don't then half your plans go haywire. So therefore, cross examination is something which is not in your hands, though it is in your hands, but it is not in your hands in some way or other. So you have to depend upon a lot of factors. So all those lawyers who take a lot of pride in doing a brilliant cross examination must give some credit to the stupidity of the witness also, and also to their luck. It is not that every good cross examination is pulled off by a great lawyer. Sometimes it is a pure chance and a pure luck. So therefore, you have to be very, very humble and grounded when you are doing cross examination. Don't try to be aggressive. It is not a criminal trial. I don't know how criminal lawyers would prefer to do a cross examination, but in civil matters, civil trials, it pays to be humble. You have to make the witness comfortable. If witness is comfortable, he may go for a song. He may start singing whatever you want him to sing. But if you are very harsh at him, then it may not be appreciated by the court. B, the witness may resist. He may become more resolute in finding methods to scuttle your questions. So therefore, be kind to the witness. Now the next stage, which is there after the cross-examination, or the step number 8, which has now become essential. In good old days, when we began the practice, written argument was not the order of the day. It was the sweet will of the court. In some matters, the courts would reluctantly agree that parties file the written arguments. Otherwise, parties would not file the written arguments. So stage number 8, or the step number 8, is to prepare a written argument along with a synopsis of case law with the proposition. It is not good enough to say just to cite the citation of the case law and the page number. It is very important that you prepare a index of the proposition of case law, in which in short you give that this is the proposition, and then you then proposition wise you give case number 1, 2, whatever cases you want to give. Then we reach the last and the most important stage, most important from the point of view of the culmination of a trial, not most importance in terms of merit. The culmination of trial comes with the final arguments. So step number 9 is the oral argument with case law, because step number 8 we already have dealt with written arguments. Step number 9 is oral arguments with case law, and though at this point in time when COVID-19 has engulfed all and we are addressing the court with video conferencing, but and a lot of clamor is made that in times to come we should be able to give good written arguments, so that the judge has to give you minimum possible time for oral arguments. I'm not falling in that controversy at this point in time. That is an entirely different subject. But please remember that whatever time, whether it is a measured time, prefixed time, whether it is 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or unlimited time, whichever regime the court decides, whatever time we get for oral arguments, we have to be extremely prepared for it. It doesn't pay that you just start reading the plain and then you start reading the evidence aimlessly, without any strategy, without any purpose, and then in the course of it somewhere you find your bearings, and then start making the point. The courts understand very categorically that this gentleman, this lawyer, has not prepared his final oral arguments, and he is just wasting the time of the court by reading the plain aimlessly, by reading the evidence aimlessly. You have to know as to which extract of the evidence is to be pointed out and at which particular point in time. You have to know as to which particular paragraph of the pleadings has to be pointed out and at which particular point in time. And more often than not, we do the final arguments issue wise. So suppose you have read certain paragraphs of the plaint and certain paragraphs, certain portions of the evidence while dealing with issue number 1. But is it a guarantee that the same paragraphs are not required to be read again, or same evidence is not required to be again while dealing with issue number 2 or 3? So therefore, and then also be prepared that the court is going to tell, no, I have already read, you have already read it. So you have to persuade the court that all right, I had read it earlier, but I need to read it again in this context. So therefore, with all your persuasiveness, you have to address the oral argument, and oral arguments are ultimately they depend upon your persuasiveness, perseverance, and patience. 3 P's. And it is an art, because if you don't make it animated, not dramatic, I am saying, but you have to make it animated. You have to keep the attention of the court intact. You don't have to be dull. You don't have to be prolix. You don't have to be repetitive. Be crisp. Don't think that if you have not argued for 35 minutes on a particular point, your client sitting behind is not going to be happy. Therefore, you will unnecessarily drag each and every issue to 1 hour. It's not really required. We have to, while addressing the final argument, we have to forget about appeasement of client. It should be last in our agenda, last in our priority. We are not in the court all the time to appease the clients. We have to satisfy them with our performance, and the performance is something which has to be judged by ourselves, putting our best foot forward, and also telling the client that this is how I want to go about it, so please don't put pressure on me. I'm saying so because a lot of lawyers take a lot of pressure from the client and end up doing something in the court which they did not want to do or which they ought not to do. So this way I have summed up the 9 steps in a civil trial. Of course, there is an invisible 10th step, and the 10th step is the execution. Because what do you do with a paper decree? You get a decree and keep it in your pocket, it doesn't help. But execution is an entirely different subject, which will require a different webinar. So and the subject was steps in a civil trial. So trial ends with the final arguments and the judgment and decree will pass, and execution comes later. So from the lawyer's point of view, these steps end at the 9th step, and the step after the 9th step is that of a judge, that he passes a judgment, and then that of a registry, that they prepare a decree, and then the ball again comes back in the court of the lawyer. If the defendant does not comply with the decree, that you have to file execution. But the 9 steps in a civil trial are extremely engaging. They are interconnected, they are challenging. At each stage, the law tells you, the prudence tells you that don't be myopic, don't go for short-term strategies, think from the long-term strategy, think integrated, and try to achieve what was the original purpose, either in filing the litigation or in defending the litigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. You have given in brief the 9 steps in the civil trial. And I think if we organize ourselves with these steps one by one, I think we can conduct the effective trial. And in the last, you have talked about the 3 Ps, which are also very important. And now we have certain questions which has come up, sir. I would be bothering you with some questions and with the participants.
I'm very happy to answer questions. In fact, topics like this are more lively when there is an interactive session.
Yeah.
Monologue does not really help.
So I would request the participants one by one, because I have Mr. Yash Kotak asked about the difference between continuous cause of action. Mr. Yash, you can ask your question, because we would like to now, as the sir has suggested, to make it as an interactive with your questions. You ask it yourself.
Yes, yes.
I
cannot hear it.
I think he's not there, so I can. So the question is, what is the difference between continuous cause of action and subsequent cause of action? When we write in our plaints?
See, continuous cause of action is nothing but a methodology which is used in a pleading to claim limitation, and also to persuade the court that we have approached with reasonable alacrity in the matters of injunction, where suppose the cause of action for claiming injunction arose 4 months back or 6 months back, and you have come and approached the court 6 months later. You also have filed an application for an interim stay or interim relief. The court will ask you, why have you come, if the relief was so important, why have you come 6 months after the accrual of initial cause of action? So then you will say that, look, all right, the cause of action initially or first arose on such and such date 6 months back, but thereafter several more acts happened, and each time when that act happened, cause of action arose afresh, and it was continuous all along this time. That is one aspect of continuous cause of action. Second aspect of continuous cause of action is this. One is that the same cause of action, when repeated, gives rise to another cause of action. So it is a continuous cause of action. Second aspect is that the limitation for approaching the court is still there. And from the time when the cause of action had first arisen and the time when the plaint has actually been filed and has come up for hearing before the court, during that intervening time, the cause of action has remained unabated, in the sense that it never ceased to exist. So therefore, you state so in the plaint, and you then persuade the court that Please look into these facts. So therefore, it should not be taken against me, and that is why I am emphasizing on the aspect of continuity of the cause of action.
We have Miss Jyoti. You may ask, Miss Jyoti, your question.
Hello. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Yes, you are audible. Please tell me.
Sir, good evening.
Good evening.
Sir, it was a delight listening to you. My question pertains to Section 65B certificate, sir, as you were
Yes.
also telling in your lecture.
Yes.
Basically, sir, the situation is that if in case plaintiff's counsel is not supporting the document with the Section 65B certificate, and the defendant's counsel at the time of exhibiting the documents does not object to it,
Yes.
can the plaintiff still exhibit the document? And my second part to this question is, can the defendant's counsel take the objection at the time of final arguments?
You see, if 65B affidavit has not been filed, defendant's counsel or the opposite counsel can take objection even at the final document. The basic principle of law is that a particular thing which has to be done in a particular manner has to be done in that particular manner and in no other manner. So therefore, if you have to prove a particular document by resorting to a particular regime or a particular provision of law, you must prove that document even if irrespective of whether it has been objected to or has not been objected to.
Question.
Please go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Jain. My question is regarding framing of issues.
Yes.
As per Order 14, the court
Yes.
is, though allowed to frame only preliminary issues and try the suit merely on them if it thinks it can be disposed of on the preliminary issues. However, they generally prepare and frame all issues and try the entire suit. So that in
Yes.
case that order fails, the superior court does not have to remand the case to be tried on other issues. So my
Yes.
question, sir, in this case is that if they frame and try the suit on all issues, and
Yes.
say while at the time of writing the judgment after final arguments, the court concludes that it does not have the territorial jurisdiction or the pecuniary jurisdiction to try the suit, will it continue
Yes.
to give a finding on other issues also, or will it simply return the plaint at that stage? And if it returns the plaint, what will become of the evidence already taken in the trial?
No, see, the first of all, return of the plaint is a concept which is independent of trial. Return of the plaint, returning a plaint is a concept where without any trial, you simply say that the suit is barred by law, the court fee has not been paid, or valuation is not proper, or the cause of action has not been disclosed, and then the plaint is returned. So that is a separate issue altogether. Now you are visualizing a situation that
Good evening, sir.
issues were framed, and when issues were framed, a preliminary issue was framed, and in the preliminary issue, uh, there was an issue as regards the maintainability on account of, say, territorial jurisdiction, and the matter goes to the appellate court. This is what you are saying. The matter goes to the appellate court, and then is remanded.
My mistake. I believe due to glitch. I believe you heard rejection of plaint. I mean return of plaint upon
Oh.
not having jurisdiction. So at the time of final arguments, while answering the first issue, court holds, "Oh, I do not have jurisdiction." Will he return the plaint to be filed in the proper court, or will he continue to
Yes.
give a judgment on all issues,
No, there
despite
is not.
holding it does not have jurisdiction?
No, there is no, because in that situation, if the court comes to the conclusion, good that you have rectified that situation, because I heard rejection of plaint. If the court decides to return the plaint on the ground that it does not have jurisdiction to try the suit, then the court is not called upon to reflect on merits. So the court need not address all the issues in that situation. And the court can hold only one issue, can decide only on one issue, that is on maintainability, and then leave everything to be decided by the subsequent court or the successor court, where the plaint upon being returned will go.
All right, sir. So in this case, sir, what will become of the evidence that will have been taken on the other issues?
That evidence will remain part of the record.
All right. Thank you so much, sir.
That's right.
I call Mr. Monu Sagar.
Yes, yes.
Mr. Monu. Mr. Gyanendra Kumar.
So good evening.
Good evening, Yanit.
So you've been a good teacher to us throughout our careers, and we've learned a lot of things about evidence and cross-examination from you. I'm glad that you've shared this knowledge with such a large group of people. I had a small question which I was looking for clarification from you. You had given the importance of suggestions and what kind of suggestions should be put and what is their relevance. In today's time, what I often notice is witnesses are smart witnesses. They come well prepared. So I largely know most of my suggestions about my case are going to face bland denials. Uh, is there a purpose that I achieve then by making suggestions, or is it something I can just completely avoid?
No, even if our suggestions are likely to meet blank denial, even then the suggestions need to be placed or put forth before a witness for two primary reasons. One is that his denial. What in any case is that I have done the ritual of putting my entire case to the witness in the cross examination, so that tomorrow when I'm arguing a matter, arguing the same case at the later stage, and then I am making a particular point, then the other side is not in a position to say that look, this question was never put to the witness, so you cannot dwell upon this point any further. That is one possibility. The second is, so therefore it is more of a precautionary, more as a precautionary measure that I am asking all the questions in the suggestions. The second is this, that even if a particular suggestion is denied, sometimes a few suggestions are denied which are contradicting the a few admissions which may have been done earlier, part of the testimony. Then we are in a position to contradict the witness with that. Then we are in a position to probe the witness further. So the witness might end up giving us some clues for further probing in the cross examination, even if he has ended up denying a particular question point blankly, as you have said. So that is a possibility. So I'm not saying that that possibility is arising in each and every case, but then there is always a chance. And as a litigant, as a litigation lawyers, we always thrive on that one chance, that one window that may be opened at any stage in the course of trial.
Uh, Thank you, sir.
Yes, I'm listening. Good evening, Jan sir. I want to just know that if there is any preliminary objection which can maybe fall under Order 7, Rule 11, and I have filed it. Dismissed. Can I mention further? Can I mention it further that this objection should be taken?
No, you see, it's like this. Primarily, it depends upon the court, which way the court gives priority to your preliminary objection taken in the written statement, or and obligor your Order 7 rule application, Rule 11 application, which has also been filed. Assuming that the court has proceeded to frame a preliminary issue on your preliminary objection taken in the written statement, then the court might say that there is no need to hear Order 7 Rule 11 application. Rather, we are going to decide this as a preliminary issue. The court may also end up saying after some time that lot of time has passed, so I am not deciding a preliminary issue separately. I will decide it at the later stage or at the final stage, which eventually, or for all practical purposes, it means that your attempt to get decided a particular issue at the preliminary stage has failed. So it all depends of a life of a case in a particular court. But the ideal situation for a defendant lawyer is always that he is able to address arguments on his application under Order 7 Rule 11, because that is an application in which he is the applicant. He can pilot that application the way he wants, and he can put across all his points as to the maintainability, provided those points are such points which are covered within the four corners of 711. And 711 primarily is structured on 2 points only, that the cause of action has not been disclosed, or the plaintiff is barred by law. You have to expand on these two propositions.
All right. Thank you, sir. I have one query from Mr. Parth Sharma, who's saying that when a defendant files an application under Order 7, Rule 11, the application is allowed by learned ADJ and plaint is rejected. Can a civil revision under Section 115 CPC is maintainable before High Court if prepared by the plaintiff?
You see, civil revision law has changed substantially. Now, the current situation, the way civil revisions are being treated now, 711 will not give a cause of action for filing a civil revision. It will be taken as a disposal of the suit, and then the appellate remedies would be preferred.
Thank you, sir. I have Mr. Bali. You wanted to ask something because I'm seeing your
Yeah.
raising hands.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Jain, just I would like to have just benefit from your experience. Please tell me regarding the secondary evidence leading and regarding when we are leaving the option of our evidence in affirmative as a plaintiff, if you could guide us.
You see, you're closing the evidence in affirmative has a separate connotation. It is a separate purpose. When you make a statement that I am closing my evidence in affirmative, all that it means is that you are leaving a scope for leading the rebuttal evidence, or you are asking the leave of the court to permit you at a later stage to lead evidence in rebuttal, because you are at that point in time not aware as to what evidence the other side, the defendant, will bring. So, in order to meet a particular point, you might be required to bring evidence again. Ordinarily, what happens, if you see the chronology of Order 18, it is the plaintiff who enters the witness box first, thereafter the defendant who enters the witness box second. So, closing evidence in affirmative is only to that effect, that the plaintiff wants a second chance. And the second thing which you asked was
Secondary evidence, leading secondary evidence.
All right, secondary evidence. Now, secondary evidence, as you are aware, the Evidence Act says in, I think, Section 62, that it should be the priority or the preference of every litigant to prove a fact by primary evidence. However, in certain cases, what happens is that the primary evidence is not available with you. Then two situations arise. Secondary evidence is available with you, in which situation you can give a notice to produce and take recourse to Section 66. The second situation which may arise is that the secondary evidence is also not available with you. In that case, you have to requisition the secondary evidence from the custodian of the document, for which you will have to put your list of witnesses. You will have to name the witness of document, the witness who will bring the document. That witness will bring the document. When the document surfaces before the court, you get the document marked as exhibit, but you will have to place the facts before the court as to where and as to whether the plaintiff evidence has been lost or destroyed, whether the primary evidence has been lost or destroyed, or the primary evidence is available with the other side, or it is available with a third party who cannot be approached. So you have to put a case across the board before the court that what are the circumstances in which primary evidence cannot be given. And then once those circumstances are established, then the court permits the secondary evidence to be led. And another kind of secondary evidence, which is the electronic evidence, which is the emails, in any case is now permissible if one undertakes the formalities of Section 65.
Thank you so much, sir. I have another.
Only specific. Just a minute, Mr. Verma. My specific query is regarding any formality, any permission or application is to be given to the court for permission to lead the secondary evidence, or it is presumed.
No, there is no specific application which is contemplated for leading the secondary evidence. But you have to show in your evidence only Your plaintiff or the defendant, whosoever wants to lead the secondary evidence, the edifice for that has to be laid from the stage earlier. For instance, as I said, if you have a copy of a secondary evidence, then you have to lay the foundation for that by giving him a notice under Order 12 Rule 8, or a notice equivalent to that, in which you are asking him to produce the original. If the other side does not produce the original, you produce your secondary evidence, and you will be permitted. As I said, that you have to take recourse to Evidence Act sections, section 65, section 66. You have to strategically take recourse to those sections, and only in an emergent situation or in an exceptional situation that you would be required to file an application. More often than not, in most of the cases, in most of the circumstances, you do not require to file any formal application to lead secondary evidence.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much, sir. And quickly, I have few more questions. We already crossed our time. I have a question Ms. Chandrakanta Singh has asked about, sir. A normal problem we face is that when a suit is instituted by a banking institution or a company through the attorney, constituted attorney, and later on the constituted attorney is transferred. At the time of evidence, what affidavit of the some other person can be filed, or the evidence can be given by the other person?
See, other person can give an evidence only on the basis of the knowledge. So, for instance, he may say that, look, I have seen the power of attorney. It has been signed and executed by so and so, whose signatures I identify. So, the institution of the suit can be endorsed by that evidence. But all those facts which the original signatory of the plaintiff had stated on his knowledge cannot be substituted by another witness in the witness box. He can suppose all the facts which were stated in the plaint were on the knowledge derived from the record, and all the records are available to the second witness also. Then only the second witness can say that, look, I had the access to the records. I have examined the records, and based on record I am stating so. So it all depends as to whether, to what extent the witness has been exposed to the records to which the original signatory of the plaintiff was. That is the question.
Thank you so much. Sir, often we have seen in the admission denial, the question has been asked by one of the participants here, that receipt admitted, content denied. What is the consequences of that kind of admission denial, sir?
Those conditional and admissions or denials do not have much meaning. These are the I would say the weapons which are being used by the lawyers to keep an argument alive. So far as the admission or denial is concerned, either you are admitting a document or you are denying a document. When you are admitting a document, then it is a matter of argument to what extent that admission will hold good against you. That is something to be argued. So as a caveat, all these expressions are endorsed at the time of admission or denial.
Thank you. The last one more question we have at the moment is, can a cross-examination go beyond the pleading?
Cross-examination can go beyond the pleading.
Thank you so much, sir. The last, I think almost all questions we have asked, but since we have already crossed the time limit, I am so thankful to you, sir. Today, you have agreed for this wonderful session. We all have got very valuable techniques of the civil trial. I have wanted to thank the Bar Council of Delhi, Mr. Ajendra Sangwan, who has also taken initiative to conduct these series jointly with International Bridges to Justice India. And we will come back again with another session tomorrow on a juvenile justice law. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you will be given the recorded version of today's video. It will be uploaded by evening. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.